You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
What's something you learned in history class that you feel like wasn't the whole truth? Better yet, what's something you didn't learn at all that was omitted completely? That's what I like to call redacted history. My name is Andre White, the host of the Redacted History Podcast, the place where history's forgotten events, heroes, and villains get their story told, one episode at a time. The Redacted History Podcast. Real history never dies. Stream the Redacted History Podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts.
Hey everyone, welcome to episode number 263 of our Civil War podcast. My name is Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello y'all. Thanks for tuning into the podcast.
As you guys will recall, we used the last show to talk about the famous Cracker Box Conference on the night of May 1st, 1863, where Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson planned Jackson's flank march. If you ever needed proof that Robert E. Lee, during the Civil War, fought to win, not to avoid losing, his decision-making during the Battle of Chancellorsville provides conclusive evidence that that was the case. I mean, he could have simply retreated from Fredericksburg when he learned that Hooker's flanking force had stolen a march on him, right? But instead of doing that, Lee reacted aggressively. He decided to divide his army, leaving a detachment to hold Fredericksburg, while he took the majority of the army to confront Hooker's flanking force.
It must be said that in fighting to win, not to avoid losing, Robert E. Lee found a willing partner in Stonewall Jackson, because although they were total opposites in many ways, Lee and Jackson were alike in their willingness to take great risks to achieve worthwhile results.
It was nothing new for Lee to ignore the military textbooks and divide his army during a campaign, like during the 1862 Maryland campaign, and also the maneuvering that led up to the Battle of Second Manassas. So such a move certainly wasn't unprecedented for Lee, but here, having already divided his army, and now splitting it again within 24 hours, literally under the guns of an enemy force twice the size of his own army, well, this was unprecedented.
As we said before, we really can't stress enough that Lee, who was already missing James Longstreet and two of Longstreet's divisions, was taking a huge gamble in dividing his available force into three segments in the face of a numerically superior foe. But in assessing the situation and measuring his opponent, Lee obviously thought it was a risk worth taking.
In Stephen Sears' excellent book on the Battle of Chancellorsville, he points out that the smallest of the three segments of Lee's army, Jubal Early's 12,000 or so men at Fredericksburg, held a strong position, but at the same time was free to maneuver. That meant that if he was pressed too strongly by Sedgwick's Federals, Early might fall back down the railroad toward Richmond. On the other hand, if Lee was pressed too strongly at Chancellorsville, then Early might come promptly to his support.
Sears goes on to point out that the major risk of the operation was that segment of the army, barely larger than Early's, which was commanded by Lee himself. Once Jackson set off on his flank march, Lee would be left to hold down the fort, so to speak, confronting at least three enemy corps.
But Lee took the risk of further dividing his army because of his confident reading of his opponent's mind. The withdrawal of the Federal columns the day before, the reports that the Federals had then started to fortify their position around Chancellorsville, all made it apparent to Lee that fighting Joe Hooker was eager to do his fighting defensively.
Instead of following up his successful flank march and making the next move, Hooker was now waiting for Lee to move. And by seizing the initiative that Hooker had relinquished, Robert E. Lee was going a long way toward lowering the odds against him.
The other factor in Lee's calculations was surely Stonewall Jackson. Sears writes, quote, "Lee had perfect confidence in his lieutenant. With 3 divisions at his command, Jackson was certain to overwhelm initially whatever part of Hooker's army he struck, whether its flank or its rear. After that, in the fluid heat of battle in the entangling wilderness, there was no telling what results might follow. Thus far in the campaign, it was Joe Hooker who had put Robert E. Lee to the test. This flanking movement, though, whatever its outcome, would put Joe Hooker to the test."
At daylight on the morning of the 2nd of May, we were relieved and went to the rear about 1 mile to where the roads forked. Here were Generals Lee, Jackson, A.P. Hill, and Stewart, holding a council of war and planning our attack. Generals Lee and Jackson seemed to be very busily engaged in laying and arranging some broom straws on one end of the box, where some bacon and crackers were placed for their breakfast. At last, General Lee gave the straws a stroke and knocked them all off. Rising to his feet and shaking hands with Generals Jackson, A.P. Hill, and some others, he sat down to eat his breakfast, after asking a blessing. General Jackson, I suppose, had already eaten, for he immediately mounted his horse and, uttering a few words to some of his aides, rode off up the road. In a few moments, Jackson's corps was in motion. No one in the ranks knew anything about where we were going, but supposed it to be one of Stonewall's flank movements. Lieutenant William N. Norman, 2nd North Carolina Infantry, Ramseur's Brigade.
On the morning of Saturday, May 2nd, 1863, the troops of Stonewall Jackson's command stepped off shortly after 7:30, marching 4 abreast toward Catherine Furnace, row after row after row of them, 28,000 strong. The division of Brigadier General Robert Rhodes led the march, followed by the division of Brigadier General Raleigh Colston. The 3rd Division, under Major General A.P. Hill, would bring up the rear.
At the point where the Furnace Road turned off southward from the Plank Road, and not far from the Knights' headquarters bivouac, General Lee stood quietly, watching Robert Rhodes' men march past and turn down the Furnace Road. Stonewall Jackson rode up on Little Sorrel to speak briefly with Lee. No one heard the last words that passed between the two of them, but Jackson's cap was pulled low over his eyes, and his expression was intense. He gestured, pointing down the Furnace Road. Lee nodded, and then Jackson rode away. They never saw each other again.
The Confederate flanking column took only its fighting trains, that is, ammunition wagons and ambulances, with the artillery trundling along behind their assigned divisions. There were no baggage or commissary wagons. The rebel soldiers would take only what they could carry. According to mapmaker Jedediah Hotchkiss's calculations, it ought to be a march of between 10 and 11 miles. The march routine was standard for Jackson's foot cavalry, 1 mile in 25 minutes, 10 minutes rest each hour, for a rate of 2 miles per hour. However, there would be only a 15-minute midday meal break instead of the usual hour.
Within the first mile, the column had to pass a small brick farmhouse and a tiny plot of open field. Here, the road began to descend to the low ground around a stream, Lewis's Run, and Catherine Furnace. The contours of the land and a gap in the trees meant that as the rebels passed this spot, the column was visible to Federal observers 3/4 of a mile to the north on the high ground at Hazel Grove, where Union artillery had set up shop. The artillery's spotters, perched in treetops, immediately noticed the rebel column's movement through the short stretch of open ground that they could observe.
This news would take almost 2 hours to work its way up the chain of command and for a response to return. Finally, though, word did come back, and at around 10 a.m., a pair of Federal cannon from the 1st New Jersey Light Artillery rolled into position and began shelling the Confederate column. 4 other guns quickly joined in.
The cannonade harassed but didn't halt the passage of the rebel column. Jackson's troops double-timed their way past the gap in the trees and continued down the road, down toward Lewis's Run and Catherine's Furnace beyond.
In the meantime, Jackson ordered his wagon train to take a wider route farther to the south to keep the wagons well beyond the range of the Union artillery. Nevertheless, the Confederate flanking column had been on the road for less than 3 hours, and already Jackson's secret march wasn't so secret anymore.
Did archaeologists discover Noah's Ark?
Is the rapture coming as soon as the Euphrates River dries up?
Does the Bible condemn abortion?
Don't you wish you had a trustworthy academic resource to help make sense of all of this?
Well, I'm Dan Beecher, and he's award-winning Bible scholar and TikTok sensation Dr. Dan McClellan, and we want to invite you to the Data Over Dogma podcast,
where our mission is to increase public access to the academic study of the Bible and religion, and also to combat the spread of misinformation about the same.
But, in a fun way.
Every week we tackle fascinating topics. We go back to source materials in their original languages.
And we interview top scholars in the field.
So whether you're a devout believer,
or you're just interested in a clear-eyed, deeply informed look at one of the most influential books of all time,
we think you're going to love the Data Over Dogma podcast.
Wherever you subscribe to awesome shows.
History never says goodbye. It just says, see you later. Edward Galeano was right when he said that. Events keep happening over and over again in some form. And that's the reason I produced the podcast, My History Can Beat Up Your Politics. What is it? We take stories of history and apply them to the events of today to help you, perhaps, understand them better. We are also part of Airwave Media Network. I've been doing the program since 2006. That's a long time, and the show has a long name. My History Can Beat Up Your Politics. Find me wherever you get podcasts.
After Hooker had called off their advance the day before and ordered them to fall back to Chancellorsville, the Federal troops had kept busy through the night, strengthening their position. Trees were felled to clear fields of fire for the artillery and to create abatis, which, as y'all know by now from listening to the podcast, were jumbled, tangled obstructions created by the tree trunks and branches meant to slow down any attack.
During the hours of darkness, troops and artillery batteries were also shifted to better defensive positions. And so that Saturday morning, by daylight or a little after, nearly every Federal unit was in the position it would occupy for the day. The line, roughly convex in shape, was just over 6 miles long, guarded by 31 artillery batteries, and manned by nearly 2/3 of the infantry of the Army of the Potomac.
The Union left was solidly anchored on the Rappahannock, just over a mile downstream from U.S. Ford. The infantry here was Humphreys' division of the 5th Corps, and there were 28 pieces of artillery by the river or within supporting distance. The rest of George Meade's 5th Corps, Griffin's division, and then Sykes, extended the line for 2 miles down to the clearing where Oscar Bullock's farm was located.
The Bullock House marked the northern edge of a shallow salient that enclosed the Chancellorsville crossroads. Here the Federal line was manned by Hancock's and French's divisions of Darius Couch's 2nd Corps. In front of the Chancellor House, and commanding the intersection of the Turnpike and the Plank Road, was an array of 14 guns.
The other half of the salient, facing south and curling back to the Plank Road a mile west of the Chancellor House, was held by Henry Slocum's 12th Corps divisions under Geary and Williams. Their portion of the line included the strong artillery position at Fairview.
From the Rappahannock down to Chancellorsville, the Federal line ran south by west. From there it turned west to parallel, then followed directly the Orange Plank Road. At daybreak on May 2nd, Birney's division of Daniel Sickles' 3rd Corps filed into the line west of Slocum at Hazel Grove. The other 2 3rd Corps divisions, under Berry and Whipple, served as a general reserve.
Von Steinwehr's division, then the divisions of Schurz and Devens of Oliver Howard's 11th Corps, extended the line a mile and a half farther west along the Plank Road to the farmstead of James Talley. Throughout its length, this portion of the Federal line was on high ground and faced to the south. Some 500 yards beyond Talley's farm, on the Orange Turnpike, the Union line simply ended, where Howard ran out of men.
There was no natural terrain feature here on which to anchor a defense. Only 2 blue-clad regiments and 2 guns pointed west down the narrow road through the dark, silent forest. This meant that Hooker's right flank was, as they say, up in the air.
In these 5 corps of the Army of the Potomac, now arrayed around Chancellorsville, there were 36 brigades in 13 divisions, totaling just over 72,000 men and 184 pieces of artillery.
By far the weakest link in the Federal defensive line, as Hooker well knew, was Howard's 11th Corps. It was not only the smallest corps in the Army, but also thought to be the poorest in quality. And so Hooker posted Howard on the far right to keep him out of the most likely line of fire. And Hooker had already issued orders to bring up John Reynolds' 1st Corps across the Rappahannock to back up Howard and secure the vulnerable, up-in-the-air right flank. But bad luck and an inept courier meant that Reynolds likely wouldn't reach the scene before nightfall. By then, of course, it would be too late.
Veterans among Jackson's foot cavalry would say that this Chancellorsville flank march was considerably less demanding than some of the marches Stonewall had put them through in the Shenandoah Valley the spring before, or during the Second Manassas campaign the previous summer. This early May day was breezy and pleasant, and it wasn't too hot.
The roads were soft and damp from the rains, which meant there was no choking dust. This was a double blessing, since the Yankees wouldn't be able to track the rebels' movement by dust clouds kicked up by marching feet. 15 brigades of infantry and 27 batteries of artillery required a great deal of marching space, though, and it was only after 11 a.m. that the last of A.P. Hill's men started out. The narrow roads through the dense forest meant that 4 men abreast was the maximum, and even with the best march discipline, that meant the movement was going to eat up quite a lot of precious daylight.
As we mentioned in the last show, a fellow named Charles Welford owned an iron operation, Catherine Furnace, in the middle of the wilderness. To bring in wood for the furnace and import ore for the operation, Welford had recently cut a new road through the woods. It was this road, which ran south from the furnace, that Welford had told the Confederates about the previous night, and it was this byway that would allow the rebel column to continue its march over to the Brock Road.
From the furnace, a road also ran north toward Hazel Grove and the Federal position there. The head of Jackson's column reached Catherine Furnace shortly after 8 a.m. The area all around the furnace buildings had been cleared of timber and, as a Union officer later said, quote, gave an open reach and fully exposed the moving column to view, end quote. That meant, starting shortly after 8 a.m. that morning, Federal observers at Hazel Grove watched a seemingly endless procession of rebels march past the furnace and turn south on Welford's new road.
By 1 o'clock that afternoon, 3rd Corps Commander Dan Sickles could barely contain himself. By that time, Sickles had been getting reports for 5 hours about Confederates moving past the front of his lines and heading south. At mid-morning, he'd given the okay for his artillery to harass the enemy column, but now he wanted more.
You see, because the Confederate column was turning south at Catherine Furnace, away from the Federals' position at Chancellorsville, the prevailing opinion among the Yankees was that the rebels were retreating. If that were the case, Sickles saw an opportunity to win some glory for himself, and for the past 2 hours he'd been pressing Hooker to let him do more than shell the enemy from long range as they slipped past his lines. Sickles wanted permission to advance against the Confederates.
For his part, Stonewall Jackson had worried that the Federals might send a strong scouting force, or something worse, south from Hazel Grove toward the furnace, so he had detailed the lead regiment of his column, the 23rd Georgia, commanded by Colonel Emory Best, to fall out and take up a defensive position some 300 yards north of Catherine Furnace. Jackson intended that the Georgians would serve as a protective screen, holding back any Union attempts to probe south from their lines. The rest of the rebel column, meanwhile, continued to hurry past the furnace and turn south on Welford's newly cut road.
At 1 o'clock that afternoon, Hooker finally gave Sickles the green light to probe south from Hazel Grove toward Catherine Furnace, telling the 3rd Corps commander he could, quote, advance cautiously toward the road followed by the enemy and harass the movement as much as possible.
But rather than a cautious advance, Sickles planned a bolder move. He first sent in the 1st and 2nd United States sharpshooters, followed by a full brigade led by Samuel Hayman.
Sickles had no way of knowing it, but nearly the entire Confederate column had by now made its way safely past Catherine Furnace. Only some artillery had yet to pass. The 23rd Georgia, still in place to the north of the furnace as a precaution, held their ground against the advancing Federal sharpshooters long enough for the final elements of the column to clear the area.
As the suddenly aggressive Yankees continued to push forward, the Georgians fell back to the furnace complex itself, taking up position around one of the property's outbuildings. Confederate artillery support slowed the enemy advance even further. But still the Federals pushed forward, and they clearly had numbers on their side. The Georgians, realizing their position was ultimately untenable, continued to fall back down the road.
The soldiers of the 23rd Georgia, flushed out of their cover at the furnace, tried to stave off the relentlessly advancing Federals. Under heavy pressure, the Georgians fell all the way back to an unfinished railroad cut. There they continued to attempt to fend off the Yankees, but the weight of numbers was against them. Enemy sharpshooters, in their green uniforms, worked their way around to the right flank of the Georgians' position and poured bullets into the cut, which had now become a death trap for the rebel soldiers.
The Georgians' Colonel Emory Best ordered his men to fall back again, but their situation was deteriorating quickly, and few of them got the word to pull back. Rather than wait to ensure that his order to withdraw was being carried out, Best made off for the rear, leaving most of his men behind. About 270 members of the regiment would end up as prisoners. Best would later be court-martialed for abandoning his men and was drummed out of the army.
The captured Georgians, however, remained defiant even as prisoners. One of them boasted, You may think you have done a big thing just now, but wait till Jackson gets round on your right. You'll catch hell before night. From a federal standpoint, though, Jackson appeared to have abandoned the hapless 23rd Georgia in his haste to escape the wilderness. The Confederates were clearly retreating, and so the Federals merely laughed at the rebel soldiers' bold assertion. Brigadier General Gouverneur K. Warren summed up the prevailing opinion among the Federals that afternoon when he said, "There was a general feeling in the Army that Lee's army was running away."
Well, soon enough there would be plenty of running away taking place, but it wouldn't be the rebels doing it. That defiant Georgian was right. The Yankees were about to catch heck before night, because despite the dust-up at Catherine Furnace, Old Jack was continuing his march to get round on their right.
A curious thing happened here back in the war. It happened to Abner Tuning, who was boss blacksmith here at the time. They tell me Ab was the best blacksmith in the entire world in his day. Ab was not allowed to enlist in the Confederate Army, first because he was needed at the furnace to help turn out iron. Second, because he had such a bad rheumatism, they had to carry him, in some of his spells, in a chair and hoist him to places in a sling so he could check up on jobs. One of Ab's chief helpers was Sprig Dempsey, who was a good-hearted big fellow and a great friend of Ab's. Well, Sprig told me himself Ab got cured of his rheumatism in a way that seemed to everybody at the time nothing short of a miracle. They were fitting a ventilator or something on the roof of a low building connected with the foundry. Jackson's men went marching by, but everybody was used to seeing troops moving, so they kept right on with their work. But hardly had Jackson's soldiers gone, and the wagons were passing at Welford, when here came a Georgia regiment, left by Jackson to guard the road up toward Hazel Grove, moving back to the foundry and moving fast. The woods were full of Yankees, they said, and they couldn't stand them off much longer. Well, that didn't faze anybody, because they were used to scares. And anyhow, Ab and Sprig and the rest of the Iron Men had no doubt for a minute those Georgia boys could whip a woods full of Yankees any time. So they just went on with their tinkering while the Georgians got into the foundry and spread out on both sides of it and fixed everything for a fight. A chance of them were on the bluff above the foundry. Others were in these low-ground woods skirmishing like Indians. All of a sudden up on the bluff there broke out such a racket of shooting and yelling that Sprig and Ab got uneasy. And then, woo-wee, Georgians began to pour over the bluff like a waterfall, and the sky behind them clouded up and rained Yankees down into the furnace hollow. Sprig and the rest of the Iron Men took out for Scott's Run yonder. Sprig said he reached the bank of Scott's Run in what seemed 3 bounds, and was just about to plunge across when he remembered poor Ab back there on the roof. He stopped short and was studying what he could do to help Ab get away, when a man shot by him like a bat out of a barn and made a leap that carried him clear across Scott's Run, which was more than Sprig could do or had thought of doing. It was Ab. Well, sir, Sprig Dempsey was so astonished he couldn't believe what he was looking at with his own eyes. He just couldn't. And as he stood gazing where Ab had vanished through the forest, a parcel of Yankees that thought they were chasing Ab came running and captured Sprig. Jeter Talley, resident of Spotsylvania County.
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation. And our recommendation this time is Chancellorsville by Stephen W. Sears.
We think Sears' book is the best all-around narrative history of the Chancellorsville campaign, so we hope it's already in your Civil War library. But if it's not, well then by all means run. Run, I say. Run right out and get yourself a copy.
Don't forget you can find all of our book recommendations in one handy list if you head over to the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org.
Just recently, we posted a couple of members episodes in which we look at just what James Longstreet was up to down in Southside, Virginia, that caused him and two of his divisions to miss the Battle of Chancellorsville. So we hope the members of the Strawfoot Brigade have enjoyed listening to those shows.
Speaking of which, it's been about 3 weeks since we've given a shout out to our newest members, so we have quite a list. There's Andrew and Mike and Deb,
and John and Joseph and Euron,
and Patrick and Savante and Brad,
and Anthony and Andrew and Jeff. Phew.
Thanks, y'all. We appreciate your support of the podcast.
And thanks to all of you for listening to this episode of The Civil War, 1861 to 1865, a history podcast. Tracy and I do hope you'll join us again next time when we'll continue with the story of the Battle of Chancellorsville. But until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.